Starfield has been an amazing experience so far, and despite my issues with its systems, I've been having an amazing time. This is a Bethesda game through and through, and now that I've finally got more time on the game, I wanted to share some of my top-down opinions, taking a look at what I feel the game does right and what it doesn't. Jumping right into it, I want to talk about the main story. This is easily the weakest link in my opinion. That's not to say that the story is terrible. I actually really enjoyed it, and I think that it speaks volumes to just how good the rest of the game is. The reason that I had issues with the main story isn't from a narrative standpoint, but from a gameplay perspective. Without getting into too much detail, no spoilers, the game starts off with a nice narrative focus. You're meeting characters, establishing the plot, so on and so forth. At some point in that narrative though, it feels like it comes to a grinding halt so that you can do glorified fetch quests across distant planets. Every time that these came up, I lost interest in pursuing the main story, and I ended up doing literally anything else, to the point where I had to force myself to finish these quests because I wanted to see the rest of the story unfold. They just felt like a gameplay wall, where the goal was to keep us playing longer, because if they didn't exist, the story would just be too short. This is my only complaint about the main story. Maybe it was intended to break it up so that we could spend more time exploring and getting thrown into side stories, but I don't know. Narratively speaking, I really liked the story and thought that it was well written and well executed. It felt a little cliche at times, but despite that, I think that it does a good job of really putting into perspective just how grand everything is. The revelations and pacing are well done and not necessarily given to you straight up or immediately in your face, which I appreciate, as it makes you figure stuff out on your own. Overall, I thought that the main story was good, with the one downside for me being the annoying forced fetch quest, but where I feel the game really shines, in typical Bethesda fashion, is the open world and all of the side content. Some of the faction quest lines in Starfield felt like they could have been their own main story. They're just that good. I particularly really liked the Crimson Fleet quest line, as I stumbled into the whole thing on accident, but the narrative was so good that for a bit I actually forgot I was even playing Starfield, and it felt like I was playing a whole different game. So far, in my close to 100 hours on the game, I've completed 2 of the 4 factions, those being the Crimson Fleet and Ryujin Industries. The factions feel like their own little bubbles of narrative, and the fact that they're uninterrupted, unless you've purposely stopped doing them, is exactly what the main story should have been. If the factions have smaller fetch quests, they're few and far in between, at least for the factions that I did. The choices that you have to make feel like they have some weight to them too. I was faced with some decisions during the Crimson Fleet quest line that I wasn't sure of what to do, because I liked all of the involved characters so much, and the outcomes were all too lucrative in their own ways. I like when these games give you choices that really make you stop and think for a second, because it shows just how thought out the pros and cons of either side are. It isn't just the factions though. Exploring typically causes you to run into random people or information that just starts some rabbit hole quest lines. I came across a ship that no one could communicate with, so I decided to board it, and turns out that it was a generation ship that had been traveling from Earth for over 200 years. From there, I had to figure out how to help those people and what to do with them. That's just one small example, but it feels like 9 times out of 10 there's some random thing happening or to check out that takes me off my current path and distracts me for at least 30 minutes. It's things like these random quest chains and faction stories that make Starfield shine. You'll walk by a random person and all of a sudden you have a new quest to go check on someone else or to visit a new planet. It just all feels natural. Speaking of which, visiting planets is as easy as finding the one that you want to go to, fast traveling to it, and landing somewhere that isn't on an ocean. This makes moving for quests really easy, but it also makes the free roam exploration easy too. Some planets do have specifically marked points of interest for you to check out, but if you choose to land elsewhere, you'll have an area procedurally generated for you with various points to explore. This is pretty cool, and initially while it's still new, it's fun. As I got further into the game though, I didn't really care about checking out every procedural point of interest, as going to one meant traveling hundreds of meters away from a different one. I like landing somewhere random and checking out to see if the place has any resources that I might need, or if I want to build an outpost there, but what I don't like is that you have to travel on foot. I've been stockpiling amps, which is a stimulant that you can take to increase your movement speed for 2 minutes, just to cut down on the travel time while exploring. Don't get me wrong, I like checking out the different points of interest. I just don't think that walking in a line for several minutes to get there is fun or engaging. I feel that the game needs a rover or some sort of vehicle to help with this. Also, I don't remember there being too many repetitive structures in terms of different procedural places, but after a while I realized that most of, if not all of them, are kill the bad guys and claim the sometimes okay loot. Essentially, it got to the point where I just didn't feel like it was worth going out of my way to explore the facilities unless it was something that I knew I hadn't seen before. Sometimes though, I'll just go and climb a mountain for the hell of it, or just because it was big, or to grab a nice picture from Photomode. Now, this isn't to say that I stopped checking stuff out as it popped up, but that the procedural side of the planets just wasn't as engaging for me as it was initially when it was all new. Some of these places tell a story about how they got into their current situation. Deserted ships with dead crew taken over by pirates, zero gravity space casinos, or even caves full of weird insects. They definitely feel interesting enough to check out. It's just that my monkey brain goes, hey, this is too much time for too little reward, and I end up skipping some stuff. So I recognize that this might just be a me issue. There was some cool storytelling stuff here too. You're rewarded a piece of the puzzle by listening to audio logs or interacting with computers, and I'm a huge fan of this method. Experiencing these places and learning about their history to me is more enjoyable when you're left to fill in the gaps. Being told straight up about what happened is nice too, but a bit of both is welcome, and Starfield does a fantastic job with environmental storytelling. Unless they were flying through roofs or floors or sprinting into walls, NPCs in the world felt natural and really added to the immersion. Now, I'm specifically referring to their narrative, their writing, their voice work, that sort of thing, not really their behavior. For the most part, everyone was well written and well voiced, and I didn't have any issues with the characters that I met. A standout character for me was Delgado from the Crimson Fleet, who was charismatic and even funny at times, so much so that it made me forget for a bit that he was actually an evil pirate. Then you have the main cast of Constellation members, and especially the 4 members that you can recruit, which are Barrett, Sarah, Andreja, and Sam, who really helped to sell me this world. Much like in Baldur's Gate 3, I couldn't help but form an attachment to these characters because of their depth and reactivity to your decisions. I also appreciated that your active companion will chime in during dialogue with other NPCs, and said NPCs will even react to your companion. It makes them feel more real in this world, as they all have their own beliefs and motives. I also want to add that you can pursue a romance with one of these 4 Constellation members and even get married. Naturally, your romance gives you dialogue options at points in the story that you can choose from. My connection with these main characters was so strong that several times in the story I just felt like a bag of emotions. If it wasn't for how well written and voiced these characters are, the main story's impact would easily be cut in half. I know not everyone will feel this way, but for me the connection with these characters really helped to set me up for this space explorer fantasy. I'm sure there's people out there who don't like the companions, and if you're that kind of person, then you'll be happy to know that you can completely opt out of having any followers and even get buffs for it. As far as the gunplay itself goes, it just feels fine. I don't really have anything bad to say about it. The gunplay feels like a better Fallout 4 mixed with some Cyberpunk 2077. The standout here for me is the gun models along with their customization and their sounds. The guns look great and some feel pretty good to shoot too because they have good animations for recoil, reloading, and of course the actual shooting, but the sound design was spot on too. Something like the Breacher shotgun felt really good as I blasted through aliens like it was some action movie. I also love suppressing my guns and going full on stealth agent like I was playing Splinter Cell, picking off enemies one by one. The one combat issue that I had was that the enemy health scales to the point where you're just fighting bullet sponges. So 1 minute you're 2-shotting an enemy and the next you're 40 rounds into a mag on a level 60 and it still isn't dead. Gun damage scaling helped me with this a little bit, but fighting a high level enemy with a lot of armor was just painful. Thankfully ammo in Starfield doesn't actually weigh anything, so you can stockpile thousands of your favorite ammo type and just go to town on these enemies. I also want to talk about ship combat. I have no complaints in this category. Initially I felt that it was a little bit slow, but that's because you're given a ship with garbage stats. The ship combat kind of reminds me of the dogfights in Battlefield 4, and I played on controller too, so it felt pretty natural all around. I realized pretty quickly that if there was something that felt off about ship combat, I could just go into the ship customizer and fix it. I couldn't turn quickly, maybe I needed more mobility. My ship explodes too fast, maybe I needed more shields and more hull capacity. And if all else fails, I could always execute a quick grab jump and get out of a bad situation. My point is that for me, the issues that I had with ship combat initially were all fixed just by upgrading my ships. Starfield also has zero gravity combat, and this was super fun. The first time that I ran into this was when I raided a mercenary ship and they had no gravity on board, so we were just floating in their ship. Shooting in 0G keeps the backward momentum of your gun's recoil too, so you just launch yourself backwards, and if you use a heavier weapon like a shotgun, you really pick up some speed. You can even invest some of your perk points to improve your zero gravity movement if that's something you're into. Again, I didn't really have any issues with combat outside of enemies feeling like bullet sponges. The loot in Starfield is crucial to your experience. It's a part of how you progress your character and how you feel stronger as you move forward in your playthrough. The loot is divided into different rarities, with the common base being white and the rarest being legendary. As you move on in the rarity spectrum, your gear has more built-in perks that typically come with more modifications, but not always. perks can be things like increased carry capacity on your spacesuit or less damage taken from robots, for example. The best way that I can describe these perks is to compare them to something like enchantments from Skyrim, except you don't get to pick what perks come on your gear, it's all random. Then on top of rarity, you also have the different tiers of weapons and gear, such as calibrated, refined, and advanced. Comparing gear tiers to something in Skyrim, I would say it's like enhancing weapons and armor from base to exquisite or legendary, for example, but you don't get to do it manually. The game rolls a rarity in a tier, and for this reason, I found myself running a lot of base white rarity gear for a decent portion of my run. Legendaries weren't always better, and I think that's fine. Either way, it always felt nice to get a new shiny piece of gear for my arsenal, even if I didn't use it. My gripe with the loot system is just how restrictive it felt with carrying capacity and cargo space. I had to max out my weightlifting perks so that I could get to a point where I wasn't constantly overweight. And sure, maybe I pick up a lot of stuff, but you're supposed to pick stuff up. I shouldn't have to inventory manage every 2 or 3 quests because I'm carrying a bunch of guns or resources. They literally give you 12 slots to put favorited items into. Thankfully, you get a room with a chest that has infinite storage, so you can just drop everything off that you don't need. But even then, it's still worth stockpiling resources to research modifications or to build outpost stuff. It got better later into my run, but for most of it, it just felt like I was encumbered 90% of the time. Other than the standard exploring and questing, Starfield also has outpost building like in Fallout 4, but it's a bit more fleshed out here, allowing you to automate production and mining as well as moving resources between outposts in the same system. I didn't interact with the system too much, so I can't really speak on it very well. The most that I did with my outpost was put down a big launch pad and set up some basic power and excavators, so nothing too crazy. Most of my time in these extra systems was actually spent in the shipbuilder and in Photomode. At first, the shipbuilder was overwhelming as there are a ton of different numbers on the screen and new terms, but after spending a bit of time, it all started to click, and it's one of my favorite things to do in the game now. It got so bad that I would spend like 30 minutes at a time every time I landed on a new planet with a ship tech, just looking at new parts or modifying my ship somehow. This system is really neat and overall I like it, but just like all the other aspects in the game, there's always something that feels backwards or like it just wasn't thought out or even just unfinished, for a lack of a better term. A quick example of this in Shipbuilder is that you can't rotate parts. You flip them on a fixed axis, and not every part can be flipped. If parts clip by even a pixel, then you're out of luck and you can't put them together. It's just small things like this which take away from the overall experience because they feel like unnecessary limitations. Also, building a ship with a lot of different halves is nice because you get a really big ship with many different rooms inside, but you'll need a map to navigate the damn thing. The game auto-generates paths between rooms, and sometimes if you put 3 rooms side by side, you won't get a door to enter each one of them. So you have to go down a floor and all the way around. It's so convoluted, and it really made me upset after building a ship for 2 hours with a bunch of halves and then having it just be a maze inside. Then of course there's the photo mode, which I spent a fair bit of time in as well. The game is beautiful, so while I was out exploring, I'd come across a nice place and think, maybe I should take a picture here. And then I'd spend 15 minutes setting up a picture. It also didn't help that the photos you take get added to a gallery and then they're used as loading screens, which is really neat, and it further fueled my photo mode addiction. Wrapping it all up, I want to talk about some of the bugs that I encountered. I've heard of some people getting some crazy bugs, but thankfully the worst that I experienced was just silly stuff that could be fixed by reloading the zone. So for example, I had an NPC just levitate through the roof or down through the floor. I've had Sarah full sprint into a wall for 5 minutes, and I've seen ships spinning in every possible direction. While these are pretty immersion breaking, they didn't happen often enough to really ruin my experience. They were just funny for a quick minute and then I was off to the next place. So after all of that, if you ask me, is it really that bad? My answer is no. I enjoyed playing Starfield. It has its issues, but they're things that can be fixed with future patches or with mods. I'm not trying to excuse or justify the problems that the game has, just that I didn't find them problematic enough to stop me from playing. The world building and lore are really intriguing and kept me invested in the story as I progressed. The main narrative itself was good. The actual quest line, however, pales in comparison to all of the other stories told through side and faction quests. The characters are well written and provide a grounded connection to the Starfield universe. On top of that, you have cool systems like ship and outpost building to really let your creativity flow. Then you can use that cool new ship to take out some mercs and get a nice new shiny legendary, even if you're already over carrying capacity. All jokes aside, I really did like this game, even if it felt like for every good system there was some sort of limitation that detracted from said system. I think that this was a solid new IP release from Bethesda, and I feel that it deserves to stand up there alongside The Elder Scrolls and Fallout. If you're considering a purchase, I think it's worth it. If you're on PC though, I'd say temper your expectations on the performance side. The optimization is a little rough and the game doesn't always run the best. With that being said though, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to drop a like, and if you're already playing, let me know what kinds of bugs you've been running into down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you on the next one.